It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Mark Smith from the IUCN to the floor. Mark is not only the Director of Water in IUCN, but he is also the leader for the thematic process of the World Water Forum, which will be held in 2015 in Korea. And Mark will talk about the linking of the multi-levels, which we heard about already before. Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. We mentioned earlier on training, who was trained in what, and my training is actually in plant physiology. So why is it that I'm standing in the Peace Palace hearing about the International Court of Justice and talking about water diplomacy? I'm not so sure, except what it represents is that I'm interested in systems. And so what I want to talk about is how the idea of systems and thinking about systems relates to water diplomacy. So I was asked to talk about multi-level water diplomacy. And by that, we mean, how do communities get involved? What might the grassroots have to say about water diplomacy? How does top-down meet bottom-up? And I'm going to answer those questions as I get toward the end of what I have to say. But to begin with, as I said, I want to take a step back and look at the challenge of change in water management and how it relates to systems. Because whether we're talking about how irrigators and hydropower or environmental share water, or how we invoke environmental water allocations, or how countries can cooperate better, the fundamental challenge is about change. How do we do a better job of catalyzing change in water management? And then the related question is, how can we use water diplomacy to make progress in change? So I'm interested in looking at these questions from a systems perspective. And in the context of this discussion, because as soon as you do that, you start to understand that dealing with multiple levels is really obvious. So it's often said that water connects. It connects with the system that has social dimensions and ecological dimensions and economic dimensions. And there's interdependencies between these different aspects that are no surprise. As water is used in farming, in energy production, in industry, it has impacts on social impacts and environmental impacts. And likewise, as decisions are made at very local levels with local communities, it can affect what happens at the overlying scales. So discharge of pollution very, very locally can have impacts across a whole basin that raises costs across the whole basin, for example. And equally, decisions made at the highest level by a ministerial council, for example, can have impacts on local communities. So if they decide to invest in a large dam, that's going to have impacts on local communities and on ecosystems. And of course, none of that, if we're working with water, is a mystery. But it does tell us that water management has to deal with systems problems. It has to deal with interdependencies that cross sectors and interdependencies that cross scales. And these interdependencies make water a complex issue that has many unknowns and uncertainties. And so when we're trying to work out the decisions that we need that will keep people most happy, or keep the most number of people happy, keep ecosystems lush and green and an economy growing, we have to be able to deal with those uncertainties. And the current focus we find in the water, energy and food nexus is an explicit articulation of this. So it's framing water management as a challenge about optimizing across 3 systems nodes, as well as a 4th, which is ecosystems. So putting water in a systems setting while trying to keep things manageable. So the fundamental question then for water management is then, how do we change these systems? How do we change the interdependencies across scales and levels to get better results? And I think it's the same question, from one point of view at least, for water diplomacy. But just a moment, why is IUCN interested in this? Why is IUCN interested in changing water management and in water diplomacy? After all, IUCN is part of the Green Brigade. That's what I was told just last week. And it's true. We're a conservation organization. We have a focus on biodiversity. But we have a vision that goes beyond that. It's a vision for a just world that values and conserves nature. So we have a mission that works beyond pure biodiversity. We work to ensure that the use of natural resources is sustainable and equitable. Therefore, in water management, IUCN's task is sustainability. to achieve benefits for nature as well as benefits from nature. So there's a strong social dimension to IUCN's work and our mandates, not least because nature and society are one interconnected system. So we work with water diplomacy to support this mission. Our conviction is that better water management and better water cooperation gives more opportunity and better mechanisms for taking account of the needs of nature in water decisions. It's also useful perhaps to clarify what kind of organization IUCN is. We're a union of members. Our members are governments and NGOs. So we're a kind of hybrid of IGOs and NGOs. And on that basis, we have a very extensive network that goes to the grassroots and it goes into intergovernmental processes. So we can build bridges. And as I'll touch on, I think this capacity to build bridges and cross boundaries is an important thing to have on board when you're trying to change systems. So if the fundamental question for water management is how do you achieve change in systems, then why is it that when we try to change these things, we're using linear thinking? We're approaching it too often as an engineering dilemma rather than a social and political change process. So for example, in IWRM, Integrated Water Resource Management, the basic premise is that if we get different water users together, they'll agree the necessary actions and then go off and do them. And integrated planning is indeed important, but it doesn't necessarily lead to effective action. And for that reason, IWRM comes under scrutiny for being too complicated to implement. And that's something I disagree with. I think implementation is practical, but you need to treat IWRM as a systems change process and not solely as a planning and design process. And in transboundary water management, likewise, the basic premise is, from one point of view, that a transboundary agreement or treaty leads to water cooperation in practice. And this approach, this idea, has the same problem. Water diplomacy needs to be a systems change process, not solely a process of high-level negotiation. So how does change happen? Now I'm going to show you some slides, finally. So to learn a bit about how change happens in these systems, we can ask this man. Here's the Sarkin Kogi, a Hausa river chief from the Komadugi-Yobe River Basin in northern Nigeria. In the mid-2000s, there was conflict over water in the communities in the basin there, among the farmers, the fishers, the herders, and there was conflict, at least at a political level, amongst the federal states, 6 federal states making up the basin in Nigeria, over the control of water resources that were and are in increasingly short supply, and the effects of downstream dams, downstream of dams. And the conflicts, especially at local level, were in part over the decline in the health of the river and the fisheries in the wetlands. So the Federal Ministry of Water Resources in Nigeria asked IUCN to help through the IUCN Water and Nature Initiative. We worked with community groups, including this gentleman, dam operators, and state and federal governments to do a few things. We collated and worked on collating and sharing data and information on the state of the basin. We worked with stakeholders on agreeing a plan for catchment restoration and management. We worked on the ground to demonstrate results, the restoration of fisheries, for example, to resolve local conflicts, to negotiate a water charter for the basin. So an agreement amongst all the stakeholders on their roles and responsibilities and who is accountable for what. Now notice that planning was a key part of what was done. It produced a plan, but most importantly, it brought stakeholders together to build consensus on the issues that had to be solved and the actions needed, and building relationships and trust, an important investment into these processes of change. At the same time, the demonstrations delivered results on the ground, showing that solutions to the problems they faced were possible, to strengthen commitment to the investments needed to make them happen. Investments locally, investments at higher levels. They also provided a chance to learn and to experiment, for everyone to see what works and what doesn't. And the water charter I mentioned was a political agreement, so all the players could be confident that their interests were taken into account. It spelled out who should take action on different kinds of issues and who was accountable. So what then changed this system? The institutional setup was rebuilt from bottom to top with a unified approach across the 6 states and regular forums that brought together the communities and the authorities above. Communities were empowered to take action, to solve their own problems while they coordinated with the systems above. And confidence in this process meant confidence in investment. So the federal and state governments set up a trust fund to finance restoration of the basin. Was everything sorted out and settled? No way. This is a complicated place. Was IWRM fully implemented? No way. But by 2009, the process of systems change in the basin meant that problems could now be tackled, whereas before they were stuck. So what did it take to catalyze change? It took shared vision and better consensus, so information and a plan. It took results on the ground. It took creating space to learn and adapt and innovate in those demonstration projects in particular, in the institutional settings. It took negotiations to handle the uncertainties, to figure out how they wanted to respond and deal with the things that weren't known, the things that were uncertain. It took politics. It took connecting to the political processes. So ultimately, state governors were involved in this, and the federal president was involved in this. It took new coalitions to come together and change the way they approached problems. It took leadership. Somebody earlier on mentioned champions. Champions who could come and advocate and mobilize people and get things moving. And it took connecting and brokering governance across scales. So the lessons from here and from other basins in our initiative was that to implement IWRM, you need to work on two tracks. One is to undertake formal multi-stakeholder integrated planning processes, but the second is to build change pathways with demonstration, learning, experimentation, brokering across scales, politics, and leadership. So what does this mean for water diplomacy? Well, in the Water and Nature Initiative, we also learned a lot from the Volta Basin. So here IUCN worked with partners in Ghana and Burkina Faso on transboundary water management. This started at local level. In the White Volta sub-basin, communities on either side of the river there had local problems that they couldn't solve together because the local institutions didn't have the mandates they needed to work across the frontier, although you see in the picture they could walk across the frontier. IUCN helped the communities come together and take practical actions, restoring riverbanks, controlling where the cattle moved, installing pumps, installing small-scale irrigation to help meet local priorities. At the same time, we worked with the technical agencies at national level to restart a binational joint technical committee. Technical discussions starting again. And together, the two countries through this committee, they developed a code of conduct. Then within each country, there were national forums that brought together different stakeholders, and they worked also on this code of conduct and validated it. In the meantime, all 6 riparian countries in the Volta in the mid-2000s were negotiating the Convention on the Status of the Volta River and setting up the Volta Basin Authority. So the code of conduct provided a basis for how to build cooperation in the basin, a focus for confidence. And the successful local demonstrations and the learning from them were then brought into the strategic plan of the Volta Basin Authority, which then gave ongoing support for the new local and subnational institutional agreements. And IUCN continues to support these processes, learning from them, helping the VBA, helping the national and basin authorities to scale up and roll out wider implementation. So the Volta then was an example of supporting action and dialogue at multiple levels, local, subnational, national and basin, to catalyze water diplomacy, including support for intergovernmental negotiations, so building those bridges. So by working at multiple levels, changes in the system emerged as the negotiations unfolded. So by the time the convention was agreed, lots of incremental steps had already been taken in terms of local agreements and action on the ground. And the lessons from those experiences have been very useful to us in setting up other programs in IUCN, and I want to just touch on a couple of those. So the first is the BRIDGE program. BRIDGE is an acronym that stands for Building River Dialogues and Governance. It's working in 9 transboundary basins around the world, in the Andes, Mesoamerica, and in the Mekong region. It's working with the elements you see on the slide there. So bringing together demonstrations, dialogue, learning, leadership, some of the elements I've already mentioned, and then support, advice and support. The second initiative is something called Ecosystems for Life, funded by the Dutch government, working in India and Bangladesh, building transboundary water dialogues around civil society interaction. The third is the Mekong Water Dialogues, supporting the development of multi-stakeholder consensus building in the lower Mekong countries. So I'm going to finish what I have to say with a proposition for you, a little model about how to rethink water diplomacy as a multi-scale process of change. But first, I just want to touch on three quick examples from these different programs. The first comes from the Mesoamerica region in the Guascaran River Basin, which is shared by Honduras and El Salvador. And here the trigger for change has been a demand by municipalities, businesses and community networks for sustainable water management. To do this requires joint action across the border, but doing so in the absence of a formal intergovernmental agreement. So an IUCN member organization there, Fundación Vida, has been working to rebuild what they call a binational management group that had earlier failed. And they've rebuilt it by expanding the stakeholder representation to incorporate businesses and municipalities, for example, and community organizations. They've been working with a champions network. So having local leaders get involved in the process, including leaders from municipalities, to mobilize people and mobilize dialogue. And through these processes, they've agreed to set up a transboundary committee, including the municipalities, that's setting priority actions, working on raising finances, doing learning together. At the same time, the Bridge program has been training local stakeholders, as well as high-level officials, as well as diplomats from both countries in water governance, in international law. And the training is a bit like the planning I mentioned earlier. Training is training, but it's also a space. It's a new space for people to come together, think about things differently, and so on. So the work here has been instrumental in lowering local barriers to water cooperation, with the national governments increasingly participating and learning about solutions that work and interested in building upon what's being done. The second example is the Catamayo-Chira Basin, shared by Peru and Ecuador. This had a different entry point. So here the discussion kicked off around basin maps. So getting technical people from each country to sit around a table and look at maps. And as that process unfolded, I was a skeptic, saying maps, maps, maps. But you get people around the basin, table looking at maps, and these people anyways, and they are full of enthusiasm that then lead to other discussions. And one of the things that came out of that was the wish for a water information system for the basin, because they recognized that they needed to work more on solving practical problems here, particularly around water storage and how they can better manage land upstream in Ecuador to help solve Peru's water storage problems downstream. So in looking at the possibility of a water information system, so very technical, officials from government agencies, from municipalities, from different stakeholders, they came together. And the problem they ran into, they were full of enthusiasm for doing it, but the problem they ran into is that there was no joint institution to host such a thing. So they resurrected what was a dormant agreement from some years past about cross-border cooperation and said, we'll work on this, we'll work with this as our platform. Adding in the same kind of training exercises that I mentioned before and the work of the Champions Network. The Champions Network, as well as the regional governments and the national agencies, then managed to put the issues that the Catamayo-Chira had to solve onto the agenda of a presidential summit between the two countries in 2012. And out of that came a joint decree to establish a Transboundary Basin Commission for the basin. So local action then fostering a high-level agreement. So moving the system, shaking the system and getting it to move. The final example I want to just touch on is Ecosystems for Life. As I mentioned, this is working in India and Bangladesh. It's a track 3 process. Jargon the plant physiologist in me doesn't very much like, but track 3 process, so bringing together civil society to the table to talk together, starting really with researchers and academic institutions from both countries, social scientists and technology people, engineers and modelers, having dialogue about what's the credible science. And then bringing into that other stakeholders, fishers, farmers, and so on, as well as government officials, so that all actors together were able to review and exchange and share understanding. And it's a long process, but this has the benefit of creating new avenues for building trust and cooperation that get around the old sticking points that have been there for a long time. And then the cooperation can filter upwards. And like I mentioned before, for some of these other basins, provide new avenues, possibly for restarting the old failed or what are seen as failed agreements. So again, shaking the system. So what do we learn then about multi-level diplomacy from these examples from these four continents? Just going back briefly to IWRM. So alongside the planning and dialogue, we learned that we need to create room for learning and experimentation, delivering results on the ground, combining that with negotiation to handle the uncertainties, connect water to political processes. We need to connect and broker across scales, stimulating new coalitions of stakeholders who can change the discussion and change the assumptions. And we need to promote leadership, so champions who carry the message and advocate change. And we're increasingly explicitly using these approaches in our strategies. And so from Bridge and from Ecosystems for Life and in other programs that we run, we see multi-level water diplomacy then playing out as a change process. And so I just want to build with you a little diagram that goes through that. So our focus can be, as you see, on agreements that are in the top right, agreements that are intergovernmental and highly formal, treaties. So we say, using the multi-level diplomacy tools, we need to work toward a multiplicity of agreements that work across a spectrum from local to intergovernmental, from informal to formal. And we can facilitate, help with those processes to build that multiplicity of agreements, working with the four pillars that are listed there. So working on results on the ground, creating spaces to bring people together for data sharing, for training, etc. Having joint action that crosses scales, so getting local people to work with higher level authorities, and then taking incremental steps. So solving the small problems as they fit into the bigger picture, and finding, as you do that, the hidden and the unseen barriers to cooperation, and then unpicking them, sitting down and unpicking them. And our job then, as the facilitators in that process, is to help, to work across scales, to really be active brokers in connecting across scales, in working with the stakeholders on communication and helping them to create advocacy networks, and working with the data and information. And out of that can come this multiplicity of agreements. But there's another level. So connecting to larger scale processes in the system. So as we saw in the Katamayachira example, it can have the effect of shaking the system and leading in part to bigger shifts in governance. And of course those are also pushed and mediated by larger scale changes in the context. But these small scale shifts in the system can help those larger shifts to happen. So I'll finish in just one moment. So why bother putting the multi-level into water diplomacy? Last year in Chiang Rai in Thailand, we hosted IUCN convened a one-day conference on water diplomacy, and the participants concluded that water diplomacy must provide ways to engage proactively with the complexities of transboundary management. It must provide the theory and practice to implement adaptive water management for complex water issues. Water diplomacy calls on scientific and technical experts to work hand in hand with national and local politicians, decision makers and stakeholders to reach negotiated agreements that can be implemented. So water diplomacy is different from the diplomacy of high officers of state, if you like. Water diplomacy needs to work under the authority of governments, but for water agreements to be implemented, for it to lead to systems change, we need the agreement of water users. And our experience is that the kinds of approaches that we've been working with multi-level water diplomacy, of course they don't replace those higher level processes, but they very importantly complement them and can help them. And we think it's really worth thinking further and more strategically about how to integrate them into the practice of water diplomacy and how that's rolled out in different basins around the world. Thank you.